You see, most people interpret silence as rejection. They think that when someone walks away without a word, it's because they don't care anymore, that the bond is broken, that love never existed in the first place. When you're dealing with an avoidant, that interpretation is not just shallow, it's dangerously wrong. Avoidants don't walk away because they stopped feeling. They walk away because they started feeling too much. That's the difference nobody ever tells you about. Silence for the avoidant isn't absence. It's protection. It's self-preservation. Their nervous system interprets intimacy as a threat, not because you did anything wrong, but because closeness activates emotional memories buried in childhood and trauma and abandonment in unpredictability. When love feels safe, the avoidant brain panics. It says, something's off. This is too good. I don't trust it. I need space. And so they vanish. But if they come back after that silence, it's not an accident. It's not because they ran out of options. It's because even in the void, your presence remained undeniable. There are people who leave and forget you. And then there are people who leave and carry you inside them every single day, like a storm they can't outrun. Avoidants fall into the second category. Their silence doesn't erase you. It magnifies you in their mind. The harder they try to shut you out, the louder your energy echoes in their internal world. What's wild is that avoidants aren't weak. Some of the most mentally strong individuals you'll meet. But the one battle they always lose is the one against the person who touched them emotionally without trying to fix them. That's who you were. You didn't pressure them. You didn't demand they be more. You just showed up consistently, authentically, vulnerably. And that presence broke their defenses in a way that terrified them. They didn't disappear because you were too much. They disappeared because they didn't know how to receive what you offered. Love wasn't the problem. Receiving it without fear was. So they pulled back, shut down, went silent. Not because they stopped loving you, but because their system was flooded. They couldn't process it. They couldn't sit in it without panic. So the silence became their strategy. But here's the uncomfortable truth. They don't want you to know. Avoidants monitor you during the silence. They check your page. They watch your stories. They remember your routines. They notice your absence. And it eats at them more than you think. They just don't show it. If they return after that kind of silence, it's not random. It's not a drunken text or some lonely moment on a Sunday night. It's the result of internal combustion. It's the moment when all their resistance finally cracked under the weight of what they truly felt. You were the test. You didn't even know it. Because the avoidant doesn't test you by asking questions. They test you with distance. They want to see if your presence was real, even in your absence. If your love held weight, even when they pushed you away. If they come back after all that, they're not just saying, I miss you. They're saying something deeper, something they may never verbalize. I couldn't outrun this. I couldn't outrun you. And that's powerful. Because you never chased. You never begged. You let them go. And that space, that silence you mirrored became the mirror that forced them to face themselves. Your stillness was louder than words. It forced them to hear the thoughts they were trying to avoid. In that silence, they discovered that what they feared most wasn't abandonment. It was connection. Real, raw, soul-burning connection. So now they return, not as the same version who left, as someone who had to walk through fire just to admit to themselves that you weren't a phase. You were the breakthrough. Let that sink in. Their silence wasn't the end. It was the battlefield. And you weren't just a passing emotion. You were the truth they couldn't silence no matter how far they ran. So the next time someone walks away and says nothing, don't automatically assume they've moved on. Some people aren't escaping you. They're collapsing under the weight of finally realizing they were loved without condition. And that kind of love, it haunts you. It heals you. It rewrites everything you thought you knew about safety. If they come back after all of that, they're not coming back for closure. They're coming back because it was always you. There's a myth we've been fed our entire lives. That distance always weakens bonds. That if someone walks away, stops calling, disappears, it means they've forgotten you. Moved on. That out of sight must mean out of mind. But that rule doesn't apply when you're dealing with an avoidant. That's not how their mind works. That's not how their heart processes connection. You see, the avoidant doesn't forget you when you're gone. They remember you more. But the remembering isn't calm. It's not romantic nostalgia. It's a storm of obsession, confusion, internal chaos that builds in your absence. When they're around you, they're flooded. They feel things they're not emotionally equipped to feel. So their instinct is to create distance, to regulate themselves by controlling proximity. Here's what no one tells you. Space doesn't erase emotional imprint. In fact, it does the opposite. Space gives your energy room to echo. Your presence becomes louder in your absence. Your voice, your scent, your softness, it doesn't fade because avoidants try to outthink what they feel. But connection isn't something you can think your way out of. That's why they run, because logic says you're safer alone. But their body, their subconscious says, this person reached me. And here's where it gets real. The more time and space they put between you, the more the contrast hits them, because they start engaging with people who don't understand them, don't see them, touch that same emotional depth. And it exposes how rare your bond was. The conversations they have with others feel shallow. The energy is off. The connection feels transactional, not transformational. And that realization creeps in slowly, like smoke under a door. I didn't feel this way with anyone else. Why can't I shake her? Avoidants live in emotional compartments. They store feelings in locked rooms. But when a bond goes deep enough, breaks the walls between those compartments. Your love seeped into the parts they swore no one would ever touch. That's why silence doesn't save them. That's why distance doesn't heal them. It actually makes the wound louder. Distract themselves? Absolutely. With work, with friends, with flings. They'll convince themselves they're moving on. And on the surface, it might even look like they are. But behind the scenes, they're mentally circling you. Remembering how calm they felt when you looked at them without judgment. How safe they felt when you didn't ask them to perform or be anything more than who they were. That kind of connection doesn't fade, it imprints. Avoidant doesn't reflect like the rest of us. They don't sit and journal their feelings. They feel by comparison, meaning they only begin to realize what you meant once they try to replace you and fail. So when they come back, and I mean really come back, not with games or half efforts, they're not returning because you reminded them of something good. They're returning because your absence made everything else feel wrong. They're not comparing you to someone new. They're comparing everyone new to you. And nothing is measuring up. Let me be clear. This isn't about romanticizing avoidance. It's not about excusing the silence or making it holy. It is about understanding what happens in that silence. Because most people think silence is avoid, but in the avoidance world, silence is a pressure cooker. And if they return after all that distance, it's not weakness, it's revelation. It means your connection with them had depth. It left a psychological signature they couldn't scrub out, no matter how hard they tried. And that signature echoed louder the further they ran. That's not just love. That's transformation. Because let's face it, most people are forgettable. Most interactions fade. But some people become permanent fixtures in the psyche. Not because they tried harder, but because they resonated deeper. That's who you were. Your absence forced them to hear what your presence made them feel, a connection that didn't ask for permission to exist. And when you love like that, clean, present, without casing, it haunts the avoidant. It lingers in their body. It echoes in their mind. It disrupts their defense mechanisms until they can't suppress it anymore. So when they come back, they're not coming back because they feel like it. They're coming back because they cannot come back because distance didn't free them. It exposed them. And your memory became louder than their fear. And if you remember nothing else, remember this: if they return after silence, it means your presence echoed louder than their avoidance ever could. That's not fantasy. That's truth. And that's the power of real connection. Most people misunderstand what it means when someone returns after pulling away. They assume it's a sign of weakness, like they couldn't make it on their own, or they came back because they needed comfort. When you're dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, their return is not weakness, it's surrender. Not surrender to you in a passive, needy, dependent way. No, it's a surrender to something inside of them that they've been fighting their entire life. The terrifying truth that they actually want to be loved, that they crave connection, that they need what they swore they didn't. Someone with an avoidant attachment style disappears. It's not to play games. It's not calculated like a manipulator. It's instinctual. It's survival. Their nervous system is wired to associate closeness with vulnerability with danger. So when you got too close, not because you were intense, but because you were real, they panicked. You weren't just another name in their phone. You were the one who bypassed all their emotional armor without even trying. And that kind of intimacy, that's what threatens their entire identity. They've spent years, sometimes decades, building a version of themselves that says, I don't need anyone. I'm good on my own. But then you came along and cracked that illusion wide open, not by doing anything dramatic, but by being consistently present, calm, connected. You didn't need to prove anything. You were just there. That terrified them more than drama ever could. That's the thing about real love. It doesn't knock on the door. It walks straight through the walls. And when it does, the avoidant doesn't know how to respond. Their old programming kicks in. Get out. Regulate. Pull back. They don't even realize what they're doing. It's automatic. But here's the kicker. Their return isn't automatic. That part, that's intentional, To come back to someone they ran from means they've reached a breaking point inside themselves. It means the stories they've told themselves no longer hold up. It means the "I'm better without them" narrative collapsed under the weight of truth. It means the bond was so undeniable that even their strongest defense mechanisms couldn't kill it. And that is power. It's the power of presence, the power of staying grounded in who you are, even when someone else couldn't handle it in the moment. You didn't chase, you didn't beg. You let them go, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. And in doing that, you created the exact conditions needed for truth to surface. Because what the avoidant needed wasn't someone to fix them. They needed was someone who wouldn't abandon themselves just to keep the connection alive. That's what broke them. That's what made them reconsider everything. That's what made them come back. They came back because the silence didn't soothe them. It exposed them. The distraction didn't work. The emotional expression failed. And in that void, they didn't find freedom. They found your memory. Still burning, still alive, still present. Let's be real. Avoidants don't return for everyone. They don't circle back to every ex. They're wired to cut off and detach. So if they come back to you, it's not because they're weak or desperate. It's because you were the outlier. You were the one person their coping strategy couldn't erase. That's not something to take lightly. And if you're the one they came back to, you need to understand what that means. You didn't just touch their heart. You broke through their walls. You cracked something open in them that scared the hell out of them. And in that fear, they ran. But when the fear faded, all that was left was you. Not a fantasy version, not an idealized projection, but the real you, the one who held space, didn't chase, who let the truth speak louder than words. And that's why their return is a form of surrender. They're not surrendering to a person. They're surrendering to the reality that they finally felt something real. They couldn't bury it, no matter how hard they tried. This isn't about romanticizing dysfunction. It's about understanding the depth of what love can do when it's rooted in truth. Because sometimes the most powerful transformation doesn't happen through talking or therapy or advice. Sometimes it happens when someone loses the one person who didn't try to fix them, the one who simply stood in their truth and walked away when they weren't met with the same. And when they return after that, they're not just showing up at your door. They're showing up in their life finally. So don't underestimate your impact. If they came back, it means the story you wrote in their heart was so deep, even their silence couldn't erase it. And that return isn't weakness. It's their first act of real strength. Let that be your reminder your love didn't fail. It transformed them. This part is going to shock some of you, but it needs to be said because it flips the narrative on its head. Broke the avoidant wasn't your inconsistency. What shattered them wasn't your absence or your silence or your imperfections. What broke them was your safety. Let that sink in. We tend to assume that people run from chaos, right? That they leave because things are too toxic or unstable. But with avoidance, that's not usually the case. Avoidants have often lived in chaos. They've adapted to emotional disconnection, to conditional love, to the absence of security. So when you came into their life and gave them the opposite of what they were used to, stability, warmth, emotional clarity, it didn't calm them. It triggered them. And I want you to understand why. You see, at a deep psychological level, many avoidants were conditioned, sometimes in childhood, sometimes through past relationships, to associate emotional closeness with pain, with betrayal, with loss of control. So when they finally meet someone who doesn't play games, doesn't punish them emotionally, who simply holds space and shows up consistently, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as love. It interprets it as a threat because the brain doesn't always want what's healthy. The brain wants what's familiar. So if someone's baseline is emotional starvation, then safety doesn't feel soothing. It feels dangerous. You made them feel seen. You made them feel held. You made them feel vulnerable. That was the scariest thing they had ever felt. That's why they left. Not because they didn't care, but because you were the first person who reached below the surface. You didn't try to control them. You didn't try to fix them. You simply loved them as they were. No conditions, no threats, no manipulation. Just love, real love. And that love illuminated all the parts of themselves they had buried. Their fears, their insecurities, their shame. You were a mirror they weren't ready to face. And what do most people do when they see something in the mirror that makes them uncomfortable? They look away. They walk away. They run. But this wasn't about you doing something wrong. The contrary, you did everything right, and that's why it broke them. Avoidants don't crumble under pressure. They crumble under intimacy because pressure they're used to. But intimacy, true soul-level intimacy, that's a foreign language. It confuses them. It overloads their system. And when they realize that they're being loved by someone who expects nothing in return, it short circuits everything they believed about themselves. That's the paradox. more emotionally safe you made them feel, the more internally unsafe they felt. Because if you love them that deeply, if you see them that clearly, if you offer them that kind of peace, then what happens if you leave? Happens if you disappear. That level of vulnerability feels like life or death to someone who's never learned how to process it. So what do? They shut it down before it can break them. They self-sabotage. They ghost. They withdraw. Not because they want to hurt you, but because they don't know how to receive what you're offering without completely dismantling their identity. And that's the real tragedy. You didn't scare them because you were chaotic. You scared them because you were safe. And safety for the avoidant feels like standing naked in the middle of a battlefield, exposed, defenseless, unarmed. That's what you represented. Not anger, but emotional disarmament. Let's be clear. This doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It means your love was powerful enough to confront their entire defense system. It means your presence was strong enough to shake them awake from a lifetime of emotional numbness. That's why if they come back, it's not just a romantic gesture. It's a sign that they've started to face the very parts of themselves they once ran from. It's a sign that the safety they couldn't handle before is now something they crave. Not because you changed, but because they did. So if you've ever been left after showing up with pure, grounded love, don't internalize it as rejection. Understand it as impact. You didn't fail. You confronted someone with the truth of who they could be if they allowed themselves to be loved. And if they return after that kind of inner warfare, it's because the very safety they once ran from is now the home they realize they can no longer live without. Let's go even deeper, because this is the part that most people don't see. When you love someone with an avoidant attachment style, you assume that if they're not showing you affection, if they're not reaching out, if they're not visibly reacting to your silence or your distance, then they've moved on. That's the assumption we're all trained to make. Reaction means no feelings. But that's not how avoidants operate. Avoidants aren't disconnected from emotion. They're disconnected from expression. And that difference changes everything. They don't process love through words. Process it in the same outward, performative ways most people do. They process it internally, in private, in silence. And what's even more important, they process it somatically, through their nervous system, through tension in the body, through unexplained anxiety, through sleepless nights and random triggers they can't trace. Because the truth is, their mind may be telling them, you're over her. But their body is saying something completely different. That's the split inside avoidance. Their logic tries to lead, but their physiology refuses to follow. They go out with friends. They date someone new. They work overtime. They distract. They detach. But then something happens. A scent, a song, a memory, flash. And suddenly their entire body reacts before their brain can catch up. That's because their nervous system remembers what the mind is trying to forget. Your presence created emotional regulation in them, whether they understood it or not. You were around, they felt calmer, safer, more grounded. They may not have been able to articulate it, but their system responded to you. Not like a firework, like a foundation. Subtle, steady, subconscious. When you left or went silent, their logic celebrated the space, but their body started falling apart. They didn't tell you that, of course. Avoidants don't like being seen unraveling. They don't share their pain. They intellectualize it, numb it, push it down. But you can only suppress emotion for so long before it begins to show up in other ways. Fatigue, depression, irritability, compulsive behavior, restlessness. That's not because they hate being alone. Avoidants often crave solitude, but there's a difference between being alone by choice and being alone while haunted by the memory of someone who once felt like peace. You weren't a person they could just get over. You were a dopamine hit. Chaos. You were calm, and the avoidant doesn't know what to do with calm until it's gone. And that's when it starts happening. They begin noticing things that weren't obvious before. That the people around them don't listen the way you did, that the conversations they're having now don't make them feel anything, that no matter how many things they check off their list, they still feel empty. Their mind will resist this truth. Fight it. It'll try to find flaws in you. She was too emotional, too intense, too available. But the body doesn't lie. The body only speaks through sensation. Tight chest, racing thoughts, waves of sadness that come out of nowhere. These aren't random. These are signals. You activated something they didn't know they needed. And the more they suppress it, the louder those signals become. Because love isn't just a story. It's not just a timeline. Love, the kind you gave, rewires the nervous system. It creates new baselines, new patterns. It builds pathways of safety in someone who never had them before. That's not emotional fluff. That's neuroscience. That's psychology. That's fact. You didn't just give them attention. You gave their body something it didn't know it was starving for. Emotional safety. So when they come back, if they come back, It's because their body pulled them there. Their nervous system refused to adapt to the absence of you. And that's something they can't fake. They can pretend they don't miss you. They can act like you never mattered. You'll always know the truth by the one thing they can't control: their energy. If they seem restless, anxious, overactive, if their new relationship seems performative, if they're suddenly watching your stories again, asking about you, hovering just outside your life. That's not an accident. That's biology meeting emotional memory. You live inside them in a way they never prepared for, because no one prepared them for what it feels like to be emotionally safe and then to lose it. Don't be fooled by silence. Don't be fooled by the lack of words, because sometimes the loudest confession isn't spoken, it's felt. And when their body can't forget you, that's when you know you never left. There's a truth we avoid because it's too raw, too uncomfortable, too sobering to face. And it's this: people don't run from what they don't care about. They run from what threatens to awaken something they've buried. And in the case of avoidance, that something is love, real, unfiltered, identity-shaking love. So if they come back after silence, if they circle back after ghosting, after distance, after avoiding you, they're not coming back lightly. They're not bored. They're not looking for attention. They're returning because they've failed at outrunning you. Because somewhere between their silence and their solitude, they realized something no distraction could silence. They couldn't unlove you. Just a person they dated. You weren't a nice memory or a placeholder or a warm body in a cold season. You were the one who got in. The one who slipped through their carefully built defense mechanisms, who mirrored something they never saw in themselves: worthiness, safety, belonging, and that terrified them. They tried to file you away like the rest. They told themselves the story: I'll move on. I'll forget. This is nothing. But that story started to crumble when nothing else filled the gap, when no one else resonated on the same frequency, when every replacement felt like noise after you'd given them music. That's what you were. Music in a world that had only ever given them static. And the more they tried to erase you, the more your rhythm echoed through everything. Avoidants don't say this out loud. They'll never hand you that kind of emotional confession. Their behavior betrays them. The patterns shift. Their energy changes. They get quieter, not because they're at peace, but because they're overwhelmed by a truth they didn't expect to feel. You were in a phase. You were the pivot. Here's what you need to know: avoidants don't just come back. It costs them everything internally to return. It costs them their pride, their illusion of control, their false sense of self-reliance. Because to come back to you means admitting, not just to you, but to themselves, that what they felt was real, that they tried to destroy something that was actually sacred. They ran from love because love demands presence. It demands accountability. It demands receiving, not just giving. And for the avoidant, receiving love is a war they've been losing their whole life, because love asks them to feel. And feeling exposes the emotional poverty they've lived in for years. But you didn't demand anything. You didn't force intimacy. You didn't beg them to change. You just showed up day after day, moment after moment, fully, authentically, consistently. And in doing so, you became unforgettable, because the soul remembers the one who stayed present even when the other person wasn't ready. The mind forgets, the ego resists, but the body knows, the heart knows, the spirit knows.